We are going to talk about the structure of the heart. Let's repeat some of the things we said. We said, first of all, that the heart has four chambers: the right atrium, right ventricle, and on the other side we have the left atrium and the left ventricle, and both left and right sides of the heart are separated by the septum. This is the septum. It separates the left and the right sides of the heart. So, as for the function of the heart, we know that blood goes from an atrium to a ventricle all the time. So on the right side, deoxygenated blood is collected in the right atrium. It cannot go into the right ventricle directly because the tricuspid valve is closed. So what happens is that when the right atrium is full of deoxygenated blood, the right atrium has muscles on it. It is going to contract. And the same thing will happen in the left atrium. The left atrium collects oxygenated blood from the lungs, and this cannot enter the ventricle because of the bicuspid valve, so the left atrium has to contract. So as step one, the blood cannot enter to the ventricles because the valves, the bicuspid and tricuspid valves, are closed. So what happens is that the right and left atria both contract. They have muscles, so they contract. This causes high pressure, and the heart here enters into a stage called systole when the right and left atria are contracting. This causes high pressure, which forces the bicuspid and tricuspid valves to open. So now the deoxygenated blood can enter into the right ventricle, and the oxygenated blood can enter into the left ventricle. So now blood is collected in the ventricles. And directly here, the bicuspid and tricuspid valves close again, so that blood does not go back into the atria. The blood can only go from atrium to ventricle. It cannot go back from ventricle to atrium. And actually, the closing of the bicuspid and tricuspid valves is what produces the first beat of the heart that we hear, which we call lub. The heart produces a lub-dub sound. We call it lub-dub, which is the beating of the heart and sounds like two fast beats that follow each other. The first sound we hear is the closing of the bicuspid and tricuspid valves. So now, after the blood has collected in the ventricles are going to contract, and this high pressure is going to force the heart into systole again, into contraction. So here, the semilunar valves open, and now the oxygenated blood becomes, instead of in the left ventricle, it becomes in the aorta, and the deoxygenated blood, instead of being in the right ventricle, it is now pushed towards the pulmonary artery. And as we said, the oxygenated blood will go to the cells of the body, the deoxygenated blood will go to the lungs, so that it can become oxygenated and then go back to the left atrium. And the oxygenated blood that went to the cells of the body will become deoxygenated, and it will come back to the heart through the right atrium. So once the ventricles will push the blood into the arteries through the semilunar valves, after they pass through, the semilunar valves will close again. And this will cause the second sound of the heart, which is the dub. So the dub, the first sound, the lub, is the closing of bicuspid and tricuspid valves, and the dub is the closing of semilunar valves. And once the heart is in a stage where it is not contracting, it is not in systole, it is in a different stage, which we call diastole. So the heart here is in diastole, it is not contracting, in comparison to when it is contracting, either from the atria or the ventricles, where we would call it in systole. It is also important to note that the valves found in the heart, either bicuspid, tricuspid, or semilunar valves, allow blood flow in only one direction. So the bicuspid and tricuspid valves will only open in a way that allows blood to go from atria to ventricles, and when they close, they will not allow the blood to go back from the ventricles to the atria. Same thing with the semilunar valves, they only allow the blood in one direction, from the ventricles to the arteries.